Yep, you too.
All right. Okay, I think everybody is back. Good to see all of your smiling faces, and we're now live on YouTube. So I sent all of you off into little breakout rooms where I hope you were able to have a good discussion with this very simple question. What does the Lord's Supper mean to you? So what were some things that you discussed in your groups? Let's see, be sure to unmute yourself as you want to share.
Just unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
It just strikes me that, you know, we recognize the holiness of the moment of this, how special it is that it joins us as a body, but also it leaves us quite speechless and silent in some ways.
Yeah, so there's elements that can come to mind that can speak readily, but it's almost like there's something more that's happening. Is that what you're saying, Tom?
Yeah, that it's really that it's so deep that words to say it shortly is difficult.
Yeah, I knew this
And
was
just
going
to
to be
piggyback on that a little bit, to piggyback on what Tom just said, a person in our group used the word mystical. That, you know, it's a very simple thing, but yet there is kind of a mystical meaning to it.
Yeah, there's a profound that sense of mystery. That's right, absolutely. And pretty early on in the church, they started to use the word, the Greek word mysterion, which also can be translated sacrament, as a way to describe, in part, precisely because of that sense of that experience.
For me,
To dovetail off that, Jeff, something that came up in our group that was really beautiful to listen to is people not only said individually how deeply meaningful this is to them. So we're not only practicing this individually, but it's also a community practice. So it's a reclaiming of our faith individually, but also a reclaiming of our faith as a whole community.
Yeah, that's extremely important, by the way. That'll be something that we will stress as we move through, which is the idea that this is something that's meant to be done together. Mm-hmm. And that the togetherness component is actually essential, in a sense. It's just as essential as saying the words or having the elements themselves. And so, yeah, that's a great point. Vivian, I think you were about to make a comment.
Yeah, for what I had said was it's a centering moment for me. It kind of brings me back to a place of remembering what it's all about, you know, what being Christian is all about.
Yeah, that's great. One of the ways that that I ran across when I was doing the congregationalism class, one of the ways that our tradition has from time to time described both baptism and the Lord's Supper is they call them the seals, as in something that seals your faith, right? And the idea, of course, with the Lord's Supper is that you're kind of continually reaffirming and having through the experience something reaffirmed to you. So I love your language of that recentering. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. What are any other folks want to share a little bit?
I think the word reconciliation came up in ours. I think I came up with Revelations 3, where Jesus stands at the door and knocks, and he's always there. And that's what communion reminds me of, is that reconciliation again to Christ and what he's done for us, and what's gone on in our lives to upset that and come back to him again.
Yeah, That's great. I mean, there is a sense in which there's kind of a meal. It's a meal of reconciliation to a certain extent, and that was actually a common practice that we see if we look in the ancient world. Oftentimes, treaties between groups or peace accords were struck over a meal, and that meal oftentimes had a symbolic set of elements to it, and so some of that has definitely been transitioned into the supper. That was great. Thank you for those comments. Anyone else?
It's a celebration. It's definitely a celebration, but it's serious. I have never known any place in all the years I've taken communion where, you know, there's dancing and singing and cymbals and, you know, there's that solemn piece, that holy piece. I also loved in our group, Kathy Saddleback mentioned that in her Sunday school class long ago, there was a picture of Jesus standing at the door knocking, and her Sunday school teacher had pointed out that there's no doorknob. You have to open the door yourself. I thought that was dear.
Oh, that's great. Well, and that kind of reminds me a little bit, you know, that in the history of the church, in terms of thinking about the supper, there is a definite sense that God is the host, that God is the primary actor, that God is the giver, and God is the gift. So there's very strong emphasis on the divine, on the fact that God is the one who's coming towards us, right? But essential also, though, or ingredient to the experience was that we have to come forth in faith, in trust, right? And so that sense of the two meeting together and the need, right, to open the door from your own side is also a component part. And the first comment you made, Peggy, about the fact that it's a solemn, I think that's right. There are elements in the supper that are solemn, right? The remembrance of the night when Jesus was handed over. That reminds us of something, not just of his death, but actually of the jeopardy that the community always stands in. There's always a possibility that we might betray one another, and maybe we have betrayed one another and we're being reconciled, all of that, you know. So there's a sort of reminder of that, of our brokenness and the fact that Jesus bore that. But then, of course, at the end of the meal, right, is the great celebratory element, right? That declaration of being reconciled, of the fact that this is but a foretaste of what we will be experiencing when we enter into heaven, which itself, and I'll point this out soon enough, is sometimes also described using the terminology and the images of a banquet, right? So food shows up again. So I would like to, I'm going to thank you so much for these comments. I'm going to kind of shift us now. I'm going to share my screen again. And we will go back together into the slideshow. So this week, so we have 5 weeks together, and I would say, I was just thinking about this a few minutes ago. This week's kind of setting the table. And I did not think about that until now, but that is kind of what we're going to do. I'm going to give you a little bit of sort of foretaste of what we're trying to do, some intro. I want to give a little bit of a framework discussion, and as we do that, I'm hoping that we will kind of walk through a few different things that you'll find helpful. And then each week we're going to come back. So the structure for this week then is kind of introduction. The structure for next week is going to be engaging some of the key biblical backgrounds and perhaps some social practices that also informed early Christians. And then weeks 3, 4, and 5 are where we're really going to plumb some of the key themes. And that'll be places where we'll try to weave together certain, maybe some stuff from history, some material from scripture, and certainly some theological or other practical kinds of things.
Cool.
So that's what we're going to be aiming for. So what's the purpose of our time together? today. So I kind of have three, or I shouldn't say just today. I'm thinking about the 5 weeks. I have sort of three broad things, and I've mentioned this a couple of times to you already. In a sense, there's some elements of this. The first is to surface and reflect on the biblical and the theological themes that are in the Lord's Supper, right? That inform it. In order, and I think part of this is simply my own personal approach to adult education is very much shaped around the idea of discipleship. And so having some idea of knowing what we do and why we do it and what the meaning of it for, that's important for us to be kind of fully formed and truly useful to God in this world. So some things then that might come up, questions like, what does the supper tell us about who God is, right? Participating in the Lord's Supper. What does it tell us about ourselves? And not just individually here, I'm thinking particularly ourselves in community as members of the church or people of faith together. What does it tell us about creation? Creation itself is present in the supper, both as us, our bodies, but also in the elements, whether we're using bread and wine or other elements, which have happened actually in the history of the church. What exactly do Christians think is happening in the supper? Right? What's significant about it? Why do we do it? I mean, we do it because in a sense Jesus sort of commands it, but why? What's happening in there? And then as we move through, I think you'll have a chance to see, and I'll do this a little bit today and probably some next week, but you'll have a chance to see some of the differences, because I think that churches are divided on these questions. And I would argue that one way of seeing this division is rather than seeing it as just a bad thing, that we can't all just agree on something, maybe seeing it as an indication of the many different possible meanings that one can attach to the supper, right? That plurality actually can be seen as actually a good thing instead of a negative thing. So the first thing is to get at those biblical and theological themes. The second is sort of likewise to surface and reflect on the ethical and the social implications of the practices that are at the heart of communion. What I mean here is that I'm going to be stressing that and I'm following here, by the way, in the line of the tradition out of which our own church arises, the Reformed tradition. But way back in the day when that tradition was sort of first kind of coming into being, John Calvin, who was sort of at the head of that, argued, all this discussion about an argument over what happens to the bread and the wine, which is what was going on between Luther and the Catholics, is the essence or the internal reality of the bread transformed, transubstantiated, or not? They were making these arguments. Calvin said, the point of the supper is not so much exactly what happens to the elements, but it's all the things that we do around that. It's the whole context of the supper, right? And what do I mean by that? We confess our sins, right? We receive forgiveness. We pass the peace. We participate in the supper. We sing songs. We hear the word, right? All of those practices are also sort of root things. They're core things that are meant to shape us and to give us an indication in our own ways and in our own places about how we might live with one another. What's our job out in the world, right? So if you're passing the peace inside of the church, well, one of the reasons for doing that is precisely because you're practicing what it means to pass the peace outside, right? So that's the kind of thing that I want to challenge us to be thinking about as we move through. And that, as I say here, how does the Lord's Supper connect to discipleship? And then the last thing that will probably show up from time to time are to connote some of the biblical backgrounds for the supper and pay some attention to some of the early influences on the early Christians in the ways that they practiced the supper. So what are the key biblical backgrounds? We'll look at some texts regarding this next week. And then I want to talk a little bit about the importance that the supper played in shaping the identity of the early Christian church. And it actually is pretty profound if you kind of sit back and think about that the Lord's Supper plays a role, not just in the life, the internal life of the church, it actually becomes the central point of their mission work, right? So the earliest arguments about whether Gentiles should be included are arguments about whether we can eat with them or not. And so that'll be something that we'll talk a little bit about. We do have a challenge, and that's a challenge that I've tried to already highlight for you to a certain extent, which is that we can't get at everything in 5 weeks. Basically, that's kind of the challenge, right? And it kind of runs along 2 lines. One is that, yes, we are going to be doing our best to give a description. I'm going to be doing my best to give a description, but I'm not going to be able to hit on every aspect of the significance of the supper in 5 weeks. And I also want to recognize, of course, and you probably recognize that I'm coming from a particular perspective, right? So I'm not necessarily going to be able to do justice, for instance, say to the Orthodox position on the Lord's Supper, or the Catholic position, or even the Lutheran position, etc. So I just want to make sure that we all sort of have that in the back of our mind, and just know that I'm not trying to overlook something. It's really just trying to figure out what we can get into these 5 weeks without overloading everything. Now, as a way, though, I do want to take a second here as a way of showing you that manifold or multidimensionality of the supper. You can actually see it in some of the common names that have been used in the history of the church and by different traditions. And so I thought it would be worth our while just for a moment actually to kind of pause here before I sort of give you some of the framework stuff that I want to do at the end. And to walk through these are the 5 most common titles. All right. So the first one is what I've been using especially, and this is the one I think I probably in the most for myself, having grown up in the Methodist tradition, etc. The Lord's Supper. Right. So what does this get at? What does this title evoke? Well, it evokes, first of all, the context of an intimate meal, right? Where you are fed, where you are sustained, where you are nourished, right? Where you meet one another. It also, the supper evokes, as I say here, the biblical background of the different kinds of meals that probably influenced the early Christian practice of eating the supper, right? And there were 2 different ones, and I'm going to talk about those next week, but there was a covenantal and there was a thank offering meal. And so the 2 of these are especially close together, and use of this title, Lord's Supper, or the Supper of the Lord, which is the way that Paul describes it. This is obviously very early. So 1 Corinthians 11 is a place where we find this. The second one, which is just as early, shows up just as early as the first one, is the term Eucharist, right? So the Eucharist. And that term, that word Eucharistia, Eucharist is just an anglicized version of Eucharistia. That word just means thanksgiving, to give thanks. And there was a very definite sense that this is a meal of thanksgiving, right? And so you are engaging in it. Jesus himself gives thanks, right, when he takes up the elements. So the acts of giving thanks for creation, for salvation, for the ongoing presence of Christ, for the forgiveness of sins, all of those kinds of things. That's why that's what this word especially evokes. And as I say here, it was early on, pretty early on. It's almost practically synonymous with the one above. So you can find this, in the same text by a single author, the use of both of these terms. And Paul himself sort of seems to use that, though I think he probably preferred a little bit more the first one. The third one, Holy Communion, this is one that certainly I've also heard it. I think we actually use this, communion is the title that we use at our church. And so this has some definite backgrounds. I wasn't able to find out exactly when this title came into being as being used in the church, but what it gets at, this idea of communion, right? Of coming together, communion, right? So as I say here, it speaks about the way in which the meal itself is actually the place where the true essence of the church appears. And what I mean by that is if to be church, to be together is to be reconciled, to be one with one another, the place where we see that most clearly, at least the title of this, is understood to be in participating in the supper, right? And in fact, there are some folks who would argue that the Lord's Supper makes the church. I'm not going to go that far, but the idea, you get it, right? And it sits there, right there in the word, communion, right? Coming together, becoming one. The fourth word is the Mass. This is going to come out of a Roman Catholic background, especially, I'm sure, if any of you grew up Catholic or you have Catholic friends, etc., family members, you're going to be familiar with this term. So this is a term that is first developed in the 3rd century, probably in Antioch is what I was able to find. And the word Mass derives from the word for dismissal. And the idea is that the Mass is supposed to be an event that after it's over, it thrusts you out into the world, right? That it speaks about mission. And so the participation in the Mass is at least early on. I don't, in terms of the way it evolves over time, it certainly changes a little bit. But it was supposed to be this idea of human beings coming together with God and cooperating with God in the work of redeeming the world, right? And of course, at the center of that work of redemption is the work of Christ, right? The work that Christ does by giving of himself, a work that culminates in the cross. And so over time, the Mass also takes on the notion of the representation of the sacrifice of Christ. And so and I'm going to do my best to kind of peel off a little bit of this notion of sacrifice as we move through, because that's definitely a background component, but it also has certain problematic elements too. So we'll do our best to kind of attend to that as we move through. Eventually, of course, for traditions that were focused on the Mass, there was quite a bit, or utilize this terminology, arguments around what it was that happened in and to the elements, that is, the wine and the bread, became central, right? So, in other words, how do the bread and the wine signify the body and the blood of Christ? How exactly does that occur? And so we eventually get the theory or the theology of transubstantiation. Lastly, the last one, and then I'll stop and see what kind of comments or questions that you may have, comes out of the Orthodox tradition. And this is the term Synaxis. So they will either use Eucharist or Synaxis, and typically they'll probably use both. But Synaxis is a word that means union, right? It's the union of church with God, the union of us with one another and of us together with God. And it's meant to signify, as I say here, the divine and human currency, the back and forth that is supposed to be happening between God and creation. And that is what is especially taking place in the context of the Lord's Supper. Now, as you can see, like each of these approaches highlights several components that might be slightly different than others, but they can be complementary. But you can also see how manifold and how many different possible meanings could be drawn out of this. And so that's why I said just a few minutes ago that we do have this challenge of doing the best that we can in the 5 weeks that we're given. So let me just stop though for a second and see what kind of comments or questions you may have here today on our first time together.
That's it.
I've always loved communion, and I love the communion Sundays where we come together and share that meal. It's always interesting to me to be at a wedding or a funeral or whatever of a Catholic person where they're serving communion, but that they will not serve anyone who is not Catholic. And so, you know, it always feels a little bit strange to be excluded from that, but I guess that they consider we don't believe it the same way, or we don't accept it the same way. I don't understand why they have to be so exclusive. I mean, maybe you could tell me.
Yeah, I can certainly give what I think is the motivation. Now, I'm gonna, by the way, when we move in, I'm going to advocate for open communion, which I think is basically what we practice at our church. Open communion means that anyone, period, can come to the table. And so I think it'd be fair to say what the Catholic position, the Orthodox actually, I don't think that they practice closed communion, but certainly the Catholic tradition has a certain specific kind of closed communion, and there's closed and then there's closed, right? So one kind of closed communion, which is one that you might encounter in Protestant churches, is that you have to at least be baptized to come forward, right? So there is a requirement in a sense there. And there's an argument that is often made, and I think that this argument has a lot of legitimacy, even though I would still argue for a totally open communion. But part of the argument is that people need to when they participate in the supper, they are making promises to God and to one another, and they need to know what that is about, and that baptism signifies that initial thing. Within the Catholic situation, the closeness has to do certainly with that element of making promises to one another, but it also has to do with a couple of other things. One of which is to do with what is the source of authority within the church, the Bishop of Rome, right? And you have to be in good standing, in a sense, with the Bishop of Rome. That's number one. And number two is this belief that, and I love this, I think, and I don't think this requires closed communion, but I am going to pick up on this. It's both the Catholic and Orthodox assumption that when you participate in the Lord's Supper, you're not just eating with one another in that localized space. You're not just eating with Jesus, who's made present to you in the Spirit. You are also eating with all those who have come before and all those who will go after. You are participating, like literally you are kind of knit into this large story, right? The whole body of Christ. Because of that, that assumption, there is a belief, and they press this very hard, that that first of all, communion should not be a place where we do a lot of experimentation, because we need to hold to the ways and means and practices of those who've come before, precisely to honor them, because they're also at the table. And there's also a sense that that means then that it should be guarded very carefully, right? So that sort of broad sense of connection to those who've come before and those who will come after, that sense of connection to those who not just are gathering in one local space, and the fact that they also need to be in good standing with the Bishop of Rome, that tends to be the reason why most folks are excluded. You can, of course, go up, put your arms across, and receive a blessing. If you're in a Catholic wedding, and you don't want to feel weird having to sit there. Okay, so I got a couple of chat questions, and I can hear Elgin laughing, so I think they must be pretty good. Let's see here. So Deb,
Thinks we should.
Oh, no.
You were going to say
I
something.
know I'm not.
Oh my. Oh, that's great. Okay.
Speaking of, I'm not.
Wow, that's interesting, Deb.
Just wanted to let you know. I'm not.
Hey, Deb, do you want to say anything else about this comment?
Yeah, it was my sister-in-law's funeral, and she was the only Catholic, plus her family, which essentially excluded 80% of the people in the room. It was interesting.
Yeah.
Mm.
Christian and
Yeah.
everybody, when I was a little girl, we would go and visit my grandparents in Missouri, and they were Southern Baptist. Not only did the Southern Baptists practice that only Southern Baptists could take communion, but many times it was only that very congregation. Even other Southern Baptists couldn't take communion if they were visiting.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yep. That has to do with oftentimes has to do with theologies around ordination, but anyway, I'm going to push back on that. I mean, that's going to my approach is going to be literally the opposite, and I'm shaped here by a couple of things. One of which is the practice of John Wesley, who argued that communion could be a converting element. That is, you could come forward in communion and be converted. You could come forward in communion and be transformed and meet Jesus for the first time. And I also am going to root this in a very broad framework here in just a second, in which central to knowing who God is to understanding that God is a host, that God is one who welcomes, and because God is one who welcomes, we too ought to welcome all people, and we ought to welcome them to the table. We certainly want to do what we can to explain what's going on there, but I don't think that it should be closed communion, though I have good friends and others who would argue the exact opposite. Okay.
Chris,
Go ahead.
Yeah, just on the closed part, it's saying something more about that this is a community and being accountable, and
Yep,
know,
absolutely.
and I don't know. So in that regard, I guess even this makes sense of hearing at one Lutheran church, where the pastor said, you can come forward and take communion if your tithe was paid up.
Well, and I plan to share also, and when we go, and I haven't really decided exactly where, but as I said, I was shaped by Wesley, who argued for radically open communion, but at the same time, Wesley also argued that slaveholders ought not to be allowed to take communion. And so there are disciplinary uses, is my point, right? So the classical excommunication, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are ways to utilize it in a disciplinary fashion, and there are other examples too. So in the confessing church movement, they would not allow self-professed Nazis to participate. Down in there's a great book that I spent some time with, the title of which is called Torture and Eucharist, but it was about eventually the use of the Chilean Roman Catholic Church of barring people who were participating in the secret police, who were going around disappearing people, barring them from participating in the Lord's Supper. So I do think that disciplinary element, in the sense of holding one another accountable, is important. And I do want to raise that up as well. But I would argue that the most basic thing that we need to have is an open table.
Christian?
So I appreciate that.
Years
Yeah.
ago, and I've mentioned this before, I think I was on the deacon board at the time, but Arthur Rauner was very close, brotherly close, to the head priest at Our Lady of Grace. And we all had communion together.
Wow.
Yeah, and hearing all of this now and knowing my Catholic friends who have always said, no, that never could have been. Well, it was, and it was beautiful.
Yeah, that is beautiful, and quite a risk for that priest.
Very much so. And that was at the height of that church. So.
And I observed that too. It's really fascinating because it doesn't seem to be according to tradition. It seems to be according to community, like individual communities, like how inclusive they are. My personal spiritual director came from a Roman Catholic background, but she's very open to a lot of other traditions. And I remember during my spiritual direction formation, we were called to visit a tradition that wasn't our own. And someone went to an Orthodox church and was basically told they couldn't participate. So it's just, it seems, my point being, it seems to be according to specific community versus tradition these days.
That's probably true. That's right.
Christian,
Yeah.
I was surprised when Danielle Jones was preaching and she said that Judas Iscariot participated in the first communion.
That's right.
I had to go check, and sure enough, he was at the table also.
That's right. That's right.
So
Definitely right.
it was pretty open.
That's right. No, and that's going to be my argument. I'm about to turn here in just a second. I think, Janet, were you going to make a comment?
I was just going to make a comment that one of the really saddest things that I have seen around communion is in my practice as a nurse and observing some patients asking for communion from a Catholic server and being refused, and because they weren't Catholic, and tears saying, please, I want to experience this, and being refused, and just such a sadness for someone reaching, not knowing, not understanding communion at all, but reaching out to God. And I think, Lord have mercy, when we first encounter Christ and make that first initial step, we know nothing of what we're getting ourselves into as Christ followers.
Yep.
But we don't have to, because we're accepted. And that's how I would see communion, is you don't have to know what all that this means. If you are willing to take that step to experience something with God, oh, hallelujah. I just get very excited about that.
Oh, yeah. No, I that's kind of, I pretty much right there with you. That's one of the reasons why I think we need to have a sensibility that this is a place where all are welcome to come forward, because you don't know what could happen.
Right.
Notwithstanding the need that Tom brought up, and some of the examples that I mentioned about having to hold one another accountable, particularly for the kinds of ongoing persistent things that those three examples point to, the kind of violence that people were doing to one another, et cetera.
Christian, here's a question. In a situation like what Janet is talking about, could that person say, well, I'm part of the Holy Catholic Church, and I say that at church in the Apostles' Creed?
It probably depends on the priest.
Uh-huh.
I think it would probably depend on the priest. And to kind of pick up Jenny's comment a minute ago, that a lot of this, that there are certain traditional positions, but there is some innovation and difference even within that. And Peggy was mentioning, earlier the priest that Arthur Rauner knew, and the fact that they all participated in communion together. So I would say never say never. I suppose that's how I would argue. That's how I would answer that. So let me turn then. This is great. This is a wonderful interaction, and really am thankful for this. What I want to do then, the final thing I want to do today is really to give you a kind of theological framework that I'm going to utilize as we enter in together. Excuse me, and it's pretty. Hold on for just 1 second. Got something in my throat here. Okay, thanks for your patience. it's pretty straightforward, the framework that I'm going to offer to you. And I just want this to be seen as a wide framework that's going to inform the ways that I'm going to try to talk about the supper and the types of themes that I'm going to try to surface as we go through. So this is kind of the backdrop in a sense. And this is my own approach, but it certainly has been shaped by many different authors and theologians. Probably one of the best books, which is a little technical, but if you're interested, it's called What Happens in Holy Communion. It's by Michael Welker, a German theologian who comes out of the German Reformed tradition. So his work has shaped me to a certain extent. But I want to just argue that effectively, we want to see this broad framework around the hospitality of God and the table fellowship of Jesus as useful, especially because I think it helps us to see that the practice of the supper is not just a discrete thing that we do. You know, there's one other thing that Christians do, but to some extent, it's a profound expression of the very basic thing that God is about, right? And so, as I say here in the outline, it's an expression that's at the center of God's ways and works. So it's not just a discrete thing, disconnected practice that we sort of do, we kind of vaguely understand, but rather it's something that's at the heart. And I think if we understand and we think about the framework, right, is kind of this broad approach, sort of the theological vision that's behind it, that will help us to see why, in fact, it is in fact a central expression, maybe even one of the highest expressions of the way that God is God, right? So let me kind of unpack these two, because I've got two things here. I've got the hospitality of God, and then I've got the table fellowship of Jesus. And so what do I mean by the hospitality of God? So the first thing is I just want to, first of all, the word hospitality in Greek is philoxenia, and it literally means love of the stranger or love of the outsider. So to be hospitable, to be a host, it's about welcome, but it's not just welcoming those whom are familiar to you, right? It's being willing to welcome the other. And of course, we, to a certain extent, are the other vis-a-vis God, right? God alone is God, and what we are is not God. So we are truly other in that sense to God. And yet God deeply loves us, deeply welcomes us, right? And that is what we see when we look, particularly I'm thinking here of the Hebrew Bible. As we look throughout the Hebrew Bible, one of the chief ways, not the only way, but one of the chief ways that God is portrayed is as the great host. God is the one who sets the table, right? God is the one who welcomes. God is the one who nourishes. God is the one who gives life. And so that's what we mean in a sense by the hospitality of God. So let me give you just a few examples from Scripture, particularly in the Torah, and then one from the prophets. So the book of Genesis is full of these themes and images, if you just kind of take the time to sit with it a bit. So I've highlighted here Genesis chapter 1 and 2, which is the creation accounts, and then Genesis 18 and 19. In chapter 18 is where Abraham hosts the three figures, right, at Mamre, who turn out to be, in some sense, Yahweh. The text never makes it fully clear, but eventually Yahweh is speaking to them through one of the representatives. And then Genesis 19 is the episode of Sodom and Gomorrah. And what we get, if we start there, we get a profound contrast between the righteousness of Abraham, which is expressed through hospitality, and the profound unrighteousness of Sodom and Gomorrah, who rather than hosting and welcoming the angels, try to rape them, right? And so that's a around hospitality. Well, if you go back actually and you look at Genesis, you look at the creation story, particularly Genesis chapter 1, one of the things that we see is that God is literally in the act of creating, he's making space and time for humanity and for creatures to live, right, to flourish. And so there's a sense in which not only is God depicted as Lord, of course, as the one who calls all things into being, but as the host, as the one who is setting the table, who is creating the spaces, who is filling those spaces up. So hosting, being hospitable is central not just to righteous human beings like Abraham, but also God's own life, God's own way of being is marked in this. In Exodus 24, there are a few other examples we might point to. We might point to, the importance of certain meals, right? Passover meal, thank offering meals, etc. One passage that I thought was interesting is when I was preparing today was in Exodus 24, where Moses takes not only himself, not only is it Moses and Aaron, but also the 70 elders who are going to assist in governing Israel in the wilderness. They go and sit in God's presence in fear and trembling. And what does the text tell us? It tells us that they ate and they drank. So to sit in some sense, to sit in God's presence, to be in God's presence, includes the notion of being hosted, of being cared for, right? Of being nourished. And then the last example that I thought was worthwhile, these are just sort of, again, examples loosely connected just to make the point that hospitality is central. Here in Isaiah 25, so if I pulled out that text, unfortunately, we can't read through all of these texts, but we'll do some of that next week. But in Isaiah 25, we get the great promise that eventually God is going to wipe away death forever. And that promise, right? So this is in the context of the final day, the last days, right? The end towards which all things are moving. The description there is of a banquet, right? That God is going to set forth a banquet as part of that process of removing the power, the shroud of death is basically the way the text describes it. So what do these offer? They offer to us a sense that at the beginning in God's creative work, there is a hosting, hospitality element. That part of the work that God does is hospitable, is welcoming work. That being in God's presence, right, in Exodus 24, so being in the presence of God includes being held, being welcomed, right? Being hosted, with the possibility of there being, food and drink even, right? Those kind of basic images. And then, of course, salvation at the end is itself described as a great banquet meal, right? So the whole, just think about the range of activities of who God is, the beginning, the middle, the end. All of this notion of hospitality shows up again and again. And so I think this is a way, from my perspective, this becomes an important framework piece for us to think about the larger realities of which our participation in the Lord's Supper speaks, and that this makes perfect sense on a certain level. It's not just that Jesus commands it; it's that this is also deeply rooted in the ways of Yahweh, right? In the ways of the Jewish people, etc. So before we kind of move into the second one, let me just kind of quickly offer you, if we went through those texts and we had time to really dig down, we could come up with what I would describe as an anatomy of hospitality, of what we see in the biblical story. So what does it tend to look like? Well, first of all, it's radically open, right? So this is where I was coming from earlier when I said I'm going to argue for open communion, in part because that is precisely what hospitality is about, right? It's especially open to the stranger or the outsider, right? It's especially welcoming. It's something that cares both for the body and the soul or the spirit, right? So both that the physical part of us that matters to God just as much as that that unseen part matters to God, the breath that God has given to us, and that hospitality is holistic in that sense, right? It is understood as a genuine act of service, right? That you are engaging in work, true work, and this is a place where you could actually bring in discussions about vocation and hospitality. Those two things actually intersect very interestingly. If we, one of the things that's really remarkable is that, especially when you read the Abraham account, but also if you look at Isaiah 25, is how gratuitous and over the top it is, right? The meal that Abraham prepares at the Oaks of Mamre, like no one could have hoped to have eaten that. Like they were going to have leftovers upon leftovers upon leftovers. But what that says though, is that hospitality is profound. It's grace, it's charis, it's gift, it's gratuitous, it's beyond, right? And that's another element of that welcomeness, openness. And then the last thing is, which would be very important, of course, and this is especially central to the Abraham story, is that hospitality and righteousness are bound together. That to be a faithful human being is to learn how to be hospitable, in a sense. And righteousness there, that's a word that can be translated also, or I think the inner meaning can also mean faithfulness. So to be a truly faithful human being is indeed in some sense to learn how to be hospitable. And of course, all of us are on that path of trying to figure out what does it mean to be hospitable to one another, hospitable to creation, etc. So that would be kind of an anatomy then, and we could see how that might shape what we would think about table fellowship, right? About the practice of the Lord's Supper. So the second one, though, is of course that this is a practice that's not just rooted in the story of Yahweh. It's a practice that's rooted in the story of Jesus, right? And I know that whenever we get together, we do like what most churches do, both Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox, and we quote the words from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Right? These are considered sometimes the words of institution. And those words themselves are rooted in the scenes in the Gospels, particularly the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of what is sometimes called Jesus's Last Supper, right? And so the Last Supper becomes sort of an important framework. But one of the things I want to challenge us to think about is not to, of course, deny the centrality of that Last Supper for how it shapes how we understand the Lord's Supper, but to think about the Last Supper as one of many suppers that Jesus is involved with. And that so there's a whole like range of places and times where Jesus sometimes is the host and sometimes is hosted. But those meetings, those meals, that table fellowship becomes a site where all kinds of things happen. And that's what I'm trying to say. That's one of the reasons why I think the Lord's Supper can function that way. So it's bigger than just the Last Supper. It's part of the practice of Jesus to be willing to eat with all kinds of people, right? Don, you made this comment earlier, right, about Judas being there. And so as I say here, we see Jesus eating with friends, with strangers, with the sick, with women, with prostitutes, with sinners, with tax collectors, people who have betrayed their people. He even eats with his own enemies. In fact, the one who's going to betray him. I mean, and I don't just mean at the Last Supper, that's not the only place where he's eating with enemies. He's also invited into the homes of Pharisees who showed themselves to be enemies of Jesus. So my point is that this is something that we need to be thinking about. That's why I think, number one, that communion should be open, because Jesus was open, right? Jesus was constantly doing this. And if we think also about this is another piece that I just want to throw in before I kind of make my final point. The last thing that Jesus does with his disciples is to celebrate the supper. And one of the first things that he does is, again, to practice table fellowship, right? If you look at Luke chapter 24. So eating together, having table fellowship with Jesus is also central to the way that Jesus was Jesus. So if we're going to say hospitality seems to be central to the way that God is God, we also need to see that table fellowship is central to the way that Jesus is Jesus. And I think this really broad framework then can be quite productive for helping us think about what happens when we participate in the Lord's Supper. My last thing here is just to give you sort of a catalog, right, in a sense of the kind of things that we might see if we look through the Gospels, of exactly what is it that happens in different scenes. So whenever you get into these meal settings, there are different things that happen. So affirming of relationships, right? Expressing and receiving forgiveness, reconciliation, and restoration. Showing clear commitment to justice and the welcome of an outsider. They can also be sites of instruction. And in fact, I think we should probably understand and think of the fact that the early Gospels, the early letters of Paul, were meant specifically to be read at the table, in a meal setting. So debate, dispute, learning. And of course, suppers were a site for giving thanks, right? For thanking God for life, for thanking God for nourishment, for thanking God for one another, for thanking God for Jesus, etc. So, one second here. My last slide here is just to make, right, sort of to drive home what I say here, what I've have been trying to say, I should say, over the last few minutes, which is when we look at the Lord's Supper, then within this broader framework, I think it will help to bring out, surface all kinds of themes that we might not have noticed before. And it will help us also to understand why it's important for us to participate in it, what it means, and what it can tell us about how to be Christian, right? How to follow Jesus, in a sense. So let me stop there. I've got this last one here is if there's some questions that folks have. I'm going to unshare my screen so we can kind of see each other a little bit. So I've given you a lot to think about here this first day. Are there any thoughts or comments or questions that folks have?
This is a comment. We were at the National Prayer Breakfast the day before. It was Thursday. It's always on a Thursday. Day before that Bill Clinton was to be impeached because of his Lewinsky escapade. Max Lucado was giving the message and brought in the story of the Last Supper. And he made a point saying that Jesus even washed Judas's feet. And here's Bill Clinton sitting right next to him. I think he wanted to bring some redemptive thoughts to Bill Clinton. He wasn't being thrown totally under the bus. So that was quite an experience.
Amen. Thank you for sharing that, Dave.
Mm-hmm.
Another one from Genesis that comes to mind is chapter 14, where he's with Melchizedek, king of Salem, and he brings forth wine and bread to Abraham.
Yeah. There's if you really kind of mine in to some of those early texts, you will see that hospitality, sharing of bread, right, sharing of space is just central. I appreciate you sharing that. Jeff, is that your question?
Yes.
Yeah, we do already have open communion.
Well, why are you going to argue for it then? Is there an argument?
I'm going to argue for it as my attempt to just make sense of the supper. So yeah, but it's not me arguing for us to change anything. I'm just arguing. I think that that's right.
Because I can remember us making some very general comments about if you believe in Jesus, you're welcome at this table, or something very general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would argue for an even more like, this is not our table. This table is Jesus's table, and you can come forward. And that would be my approach. But yeah. So, and I just so that you're all aware, I don't know if we have an articulated theology of the supper. We probably just have over history practices that we've done. So I'm putting forth to you, this is kind of my approach, what I think. And so you can feel free to disagree with it, kick the can to the curb, whatever it is. Or if you like it, that's great too. So you're not required one way or another, but I do think it'll provoke a lot of good thought for us.
There was one small controversy years ago when suddenly there were a lot of little children taking communion.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of went away and got calmer, but they were little, and there was some concern there. It just kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, that's a question. Do you need to have gone through confirmation, for instance? And so there are different traditions that will answer that question differently. And for a very long time, I thought children should not. I'm a Baptist, right? But I think I've kind of come around personally on that I think no one should be denied coming to the table.
There is a lot to be said for Jesus saying, be very, very careful that you are not one who causes anybody to stumble in their desire to come to repentance.
Right, let the little children come to me.
There is, and Jesus says, better to have a millstone around your neck than that you cause one of these little ones to sin. There is a beautiful story, I think that it was by Amy Carmichael when she was ministering in India, about a conflict between her, that she was involved in somehow with some other missionaries. And as she spent time alone with the Lord one night, she felt a real need to repent and desired just that tangible expression of the Lord's forgiveness. And so she went to the kitchen and got a glass of water and some bread, came back to her room, had a tiny table, and knelt down and experienced the Lord's Supper just with the Lord, with bread and water.
Interesting. Yeah.
Maybe we should have a church vote on who can take communion.
Elgin, go get a coffee, Elgin.
Laugh it up down there in Florida. Yeah. Rick, did you have a comment?
I love the different terms you've discussed today. I'm an amateur linguist. They really hit home. For example, the dismissal, we usually think in terms of dismissing somebody or dismissing their ideas, like, it's not true. But here, to me, it means you're dismissed to go on out into the world and do your thing.
That's
thought
right.
That was beautiful. Also, you can tell when I'm on my meds because I didn't interrupt you today.
You're always welcome to interrupt me, Rick. Don't you worry. Don't you worry. Any other comments or questions or things that I could clarify if you need me to do that?
Something that came to me as you were talking and just helping us understand a little bit more about, the Lord's Supper, communion, is the opportunity we have in our church called Dine with Nine, and how when we come together to do the Lord's Supper, it's not just an event that we do for us the first Sunday of every month and then we're done. it makes me expand my perspective of Dine to Nine, that is our opportunity to come together and hold space with each other as we're eating together and drinking together.
Absolutely.
Just something that came to me to kind of expand.
Yeah, no, I love that. There's a sort of there's a book, I think it's by Eugene Peterson, called Christ, like, was it like Christ Plays in 10,000 Places or something? And I think the image is the proliferation of Jesuses that are going on. That's what that's what discipleship's supposed to be, right? And so I think we could think about the supper obviously has a kind of ritual symbolic core, right? But that core of symbols is so rich that it can replicate itself, and it can also find improvisation in other ways and places and spaces, right? And so when you talk about the Dine with Nine, and we're gathering together, someone is typically probably playing the host, or maybe sometimes someone's hosting and someone's being hosted, and you switch places if you're at a restaurant or something like that. So there's sort of some back and forth, but you're experiencing, in a sense, some of the elements that are concentratedly found, I suppose, at the Lord's Supper. But there's a clear connection, right? And sometimes maybe it's indirect, sometimes it's more direct. But I appreciate that. That's great. That's exactly the way I'm hoping, as we talk, that you'll start to see how this stuff kind of can expand out. Like, I mean, one of the things about the hospitality thing is it's not just about welcoming and hosting our friends, which can be a little easier. It's about the risk of getting together with people that you don't know, right? Or maybe you don't even like, or they don't like you, or whatever. I mean, that's part of the task, and maybe the challenge, I suppose, in some ways, of the Lord's Supper.
Christian, the inclusiveness of what you're saying about inclusion of all really resonates with me very strongly, because I've had experience in the past where, judgment, people stand in judgment of you sometimes based on their own faith journey. And I just think that that's a really slippery slope. And so I'm with you on that. Let God do the work. Open the doors. Let God do the work.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I think, again, notwithstanding the need, like those examples that I gave of, Wesley and slaveholding, and that there are needs like that should be utilized when necessary. But the truth of the matter, of course, is that we all stand and judge. We're all in judgment, right? We all, when we come to the supper, because what are we reminded of? We're reminded of the night that Jesus was betrayed by one of his own, which means that we are just as capable. One of the figures that I was working with said that, and I'll bring this up later, that one of the things that indicates is the constant jeopardy that the community and, of course, the world stands in.
Yeah.
It's always sort of, and so we need God. We're radically dependent, I think, is the argument. And that is the kind of thing that does not allow for us to just stand in judgment over one another, because all of us are in deep need for God's care and presence. So, well, thank you all so much, and thank you for hanging around. It's like 12:25, and we've still got almost everybody who checked in initially. So let me say a quick word of prayer, and then I'll look forward to seeing all of you next Sunday. Lord, we thank you that you are a welcoming God, a God who heals our wounds, our brokenness, who sees the ways that we are estranged, the ways that we sin against one another. And yet you call us back, you offer us forgiveness, you seek to have us reconcile with one another. And you send us out into the world to be instruments of your peace. And for that, we are deeply and truly thankful, Lord. We ask and pray that you be with us now as we go forth into our week. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristen. Good to see
Absolutely.
everybody.
Great to see you.